So my advice on that is don't limit your sample too early. Because if I thought if I had 200 participants, then I could then limit my sample from that. Things are probably going to go wrong with your technology, so just be aware of that and deal with whatever happens. Comments, be open to them, but also ignore the ones that are not helpful to you. Don't let them get to you. Take notes of your process. I was actually just reading through my process, and it was my notes, and it was kind of like, this is so frustrating. Why aren't people responding? Is my technology not working? I don't think my dissertation is going to happen. Things like that. So it's actually pretty interesting to look back on those things. I think you should be flexible with your participants. A lot of participants emailed me directly, but they didn't do the survey. So I didn't want to tell them, please do the survey. That's what I asked you in the first place. Well, they didn't do it, right? So maybe they don't want to do it. But I still wanted to use their information. So I figured out a way to use their information differently as far as IRB and confidentiality and whatnot. So that's about it for me. Here comes Ian.
Thank you.
Is that applied research lab open in the summer?
What's that, Sharon?
Is that applied research lab open in the summer?
So I'm curious, how many people in the room are somewhere in the process where John is? Getting started, picking a topic, master's thesis, picking a topic maybe?
Collecting data.
Okay, well then my next question is how many are in the Tamara stage? Who's collecting data, analyzing data? Somewhere around there, okay. Is anyone beyond the data collection and analysis stage? All right, we're in the home stretch. So I'm going to be talking about what comes after analysis, writing the rest of the dissertation, and I couldn't help bringing my visual aid. I did defend my dissertation successfully last week, so I'll pass it around. I weighed it, and it weighs about 2 pounds, so it's fun to just hold and know that everyone in this room is going to be here before we know it. I'm going to be talking about 3 areas that I learned important things in writing the latter parts of the dissertation. They have to do with writing the finding, discussions, and implications, understanding what themes are, and then coming to the end of the dissertation and looking back and doing some reflective writing. I do want to share with you that I found it helpful to give my dissertation a fun name, and I know this is something that other people in the room have done as well. I was talking to my older sister one day, and she said, every time you say dissertation, I feel stressed. Couldn't you call it something more fun? So I said, okay, well, what do you suggest? And she said, how about the rainbow? So my dissertation became the rainbow. And I'll tell you what, when it's summer and it's gorgeous outside, when you wake up and you say, I'm going to work on the rainbow today, it makes it a little bit easier. So if you can give it a fun name, that helps. To contextualize what I'm going to talk about, I'll just briefly explain what my dissertation study was on. I was curious to learn about the role of first-year writing students' non-academic ways of using technology to read and write, and the role that these might hold in a first-year composition classroom. And so I conducted a survey of 177 first-year writing students, and then I conducted interviews with 8 of those students. And I was aiming to find out what non-academic digital literacy practices they engage in, who the audiences are for these practices, and then whether and how they wanted to utilize them in the first-year classroom. So when I was done with my data collection, when I was done with my analysis, and it was time to write everything else, I really struggled with understanding the difference between these 3 types of writing. In a qualitative dissertation, and in many of the dissertations in composition and TESOL, your findings usually come in a chapter 4, discussion is usually in chapter 5, and implications, if you include those in your study, also are usually in a chapter 5, or some people write them as a chapter 6. For me, I drafted a chapter 4 that had all of it thrown in. It was huge, it was this burgeoning document, and it was me saying, here's what I found in my study, here's what I think of it, here's what other people think of it, here's what it means for teacher education. It was all of this lumped together. So it was really a learning process for me to understand what distinguishes these items from one another. What I came to understand was that the findings of the study were only my answers to the research questions. I set out to find out X, this is what I found. So I was only presenting the study results in my chapter 4. And then my discussion was where I could put these results into conversation with existing literature. So this is where I could talk about how my results were supported or refuted by other work in the field. And then finally, when I came to talk about implications, it was here that I could talk about what my results meant for the field and what people could take away from the study. Now, the tricky thing for me was that there wasn't much room for opinion. As I mentioned, when I drafted that chapter 4, I just wanted to say what I thought of these things. And I would write this chapter 4, and I would say, well, here's what I find, and I think this means, and then I'd get comments from my committee saying, no, please only talk about your study results here. And so it was a bit of an arduous process, but I came to understand that chapter 4 was only data, and there's really no room for opinion there, because you're just presenting the results of your study. Similarly, chapter 5 is the data in conversation with other people's research. Again, not really what I think about it. And then only in the implications section could I really bring in my opinion, but only as it was supported by the data. This was a tricky lesson for me to learn. I would present results, I would say, here's how they go along with existing research, and then I'd say, well, and I agree with this, because this guy in the classroom when I was teaching, he said this thing, and then my committee would write, no, this isn't supported by your dissertation, by your data. So I really found it difficult to sort of put on that little bubble, just look at what the data said, and just write that up in these 3 sections. One other thought that I want to add having to do with these 3 sections is that I really had a writing to learn process. I would encourage you when you get to this part, just write. Even though it was difficult and I did many drafts, I found it useful to write through all these ideas. I drafted a giant chapter 4, and then I'd go through it and decide, does this belong in my findings? If not, I can pull it out and move it to chapter 5, or pull it out and move it to implications. And I had to do that several times, but I found it helpful to use that writing to learn process. The second item I wanted to touch on is the idea of a theme. The direction I got from my dissertation committee was to present findings, but then to also present thematic findings. So once I had answered my research questions, to figure out what themes were emerging from the data, and I think this is something common in our program. But I had a difficult time understanding what a theme really was. I came to understand that the results of a study, of course, were the answers to my research questions, but that a theme wouldn't necessarily correspond with these research questions. Now, everyone might have a different perspective on this, but I came to see a theme as an argument I was making out of my data. I'll give you an example. Some of my findings, I asked students to describe the way they do or do not adapt what they write on Facebook when they know certain audiences are reading, like their family members or friends and so on. And a number of students described ways that they don't pay any attention to audience, and they were saying things like, I write for myself, I don't care what anybody thinks, it's just for me, it's my Facebook wall. So those were findings. And I had to write through those, and I'd write through them and sort of really massage that data. And I got to the place where I realized these students are writing for themselves in the same way that James Britton and a lot of our older comp theorists talked about students writing for themselves in early stages of the writing process, when they're not ready to think about audience yet. That was my theme. That was the argument. And so I had a number of sections where I had to write through ideas, arrive at an argument, and then pull it back to the beginning as a theme. I want to share with you a little bit about my process of writing up these themes, because you might find this valuable. This is an idea that comes from Gloria Park's work. She suggested that I make a list of all the themes emerging from my data. I think I had maybe about 11 or 12. And then identify which were the most important for inclusion in the dissertation. So I pulled out 5. And she said, take a big piece of paper, put a big piece of paper up on the wall for every theme. And on that piece of paper, write the name of the theme, and then make a list of all the literature that supports it and refutes it. So I did this for each of my 5 themes. Now, little disclaimer, you won't necessarily have supporting and refuting literature for each theme. And you also won't necessarily find literature in your lit review to put in conversation with your findings. Our studies go off in different directions, and we might not have reviewed literature to put in conversation with what we end up finding. What I learned here is that it's not necessary to go back and rewrite the literature review. Instead, you can just do more reading and research at this point. And I even found it useful to do some interdisciplinary reading at this point. For example, I had some findings having to do with the way students resist frequent cell phone use. And these students just weren't represented in the digital literacies research anywhere. But when I started researching and reading in other fields, I found some research in psychology that did acknowledge similar behaviors. So I did bring a lot of new research in this chapter, and this would be chapter 5 where I was discussing. All right, one final area that I want to touch on is concluding the dissertation. And for me, I think this was the most difficult part. And Eric, I know you can relate to this. You're at the end, you've done all this work. Now what do you say about it all? You have to wrap it all up and sort of tie it with that pretty little bow. I found it useful to think about this as a process of reflection. And I wrote my conclusion section in 3 reflection sections. I first wrote a section of theoretical reflections where I thought about what I learned in the study and put it in conversation with the theoretical framework I was using, which drew mostly on literacy as social practice. And so I talked about what this study means for theory in this area. And then I did some methodological reflections where I talked about my process of the study, what went well and what didn't. And then finally, I reflected on what this means for me as a teacher and for teaching writing, what will I take away from this. The tricky part here was really being honest about my work. When I conducted a survey, for example, I chose not to collect demographic data. And at the time, I had my reasons for that choice. But through the process of doing the dissertation, I realized it was a mistake. So that was something I talked about here. I talked about why I made this decision and why I might have done it differently. So I found it important to reflect critically on the process at this stage. At the very end of the dissertation, I added some final thoughts. And so I thought of this as, now that the study was done, what was the most important thing I learned? Again, pressure is on to sort of say something that encapsulates the whole study. I chose to use this section of the dissertation to share a little anecdote. I took a course a number of years ago called Rhetorical Education, Past, Present, Future. And the teacher of this course asked, what is a truly rhetorical education? And so 15 weeks, we started with Aristotle, we came forward, we read a lot of rhetoric, and the class arrived at the decision that a truly rhetorical education, whether it's speech or writing or another form of communication, has a public component. And this really changed the way I taught, and ever since then, coming into this program, I was questioning, okay, I feel that I want a public component, but what would that public component be? And what I talked about in this section of the dissertation is that through doing this whole study, I think I have an answer, or maybe I have a seed that's going to grow into an answer. And the answer for me came to be that this study indicates the potential for situating students' writing in relation to the audiences for whom they already write. Our students are writing in digital spaces, they're developing an awareness of audience there, so there might be potential for us to draw on that in the common classroom. And so I chose to use an anecdote there to wrap up the whole study. I'll add one more note as well. Don't forget to set aside that time for proofreading. Possibly the most grueling part of the process was proofreading that whole document, and yet still one typo slipped through that I will fix before I send it to the graduate school. All right, I'm going to stop there so we can move to discussion and questions. And why don't the 3 of us pull our desks up to the front here, and then we'll take discussion and questions. Oh, it doesn't matter. I can pull my desk. That's fine.
That's great.
Well, again, thank you all so much for being here. And we'd just like to open it up for questions and discussion. I wanted to offer one comment myself, that the one common theme I heard between your 2 talks was the need for time and the need for allowing time for things to change and maybe things to go wrong and then to go from there. But we'll just open up to questions or comments or any discussion.
Well, I think I'll make a comment
Okay.
to kind of get the conversation going. I didn't go into a lot of detail during my presentation, but I think most of you should have inferred that I have had to change my research topic, which required me to basically start over. And I was almost done my 3 chapters.
You were what?
Almost done my 3 chapters. Now, for other people, some reactions are what you just had, the oh my god. But me, I look at it as a good thing, because I finally gave up on that idea that I brought with me. That was no longer working. And came to a point where I started over with something that is much better and much more interesting. So I think it's good. Not everybody thinks that way. It can be a frightening thing, and I'm glad I did it now rather than continue on struggling with a situation that was never going to be, for me to be able to finish it, rather than going through to the very end. Well, I never would have gotten that far. But
Do you feel more passionate about the new topic, the
much
revised
more.
topic?
Much more. My previous passion was based on my personal experience in the past, and that's what I talked about letting go of old ideas and being here to learn new things. And it's from my time being here is where I really started over, and it's good.
Sean, did you have a question?
Can you share what was it? Okay, well, you sort of answered that, but it wasn't a doable problem, or was it a?
My problem was that I was looking at technology rather than looking at people. And that was always going to be difficult to actually put into words. But, and I say this is luckily, I could not get site approval from any website that I wanted to use.
Oh, I remember last summer.
And so without site approval, I would never get IRB approval, which means I'd never be able to move ahead. So it was a good thing.
I think similarly, I wanted my dissertation research, and we tested so much, I wanted it to be so clean, I wanted it to be so effective, and you know, as the process went on, I sort of felt like whenever I played basketball when I was like in middle school, we were such a scrappy team, we were just doing what we could to get by, you know, and that's sort of how I felt as the dissertation went along. I was just doing what I could to get by. Okay, these participants didn't want to complete the survey, they just wanted to email me their information. So I could have just said, I'm not going to use it, but how can I figure out a way to use this information? So, you know, my data is it's really kind of messy. There are all these different categories. The people that followed the directions completely, the people that did this half of it right, but the technology didn't work. You know, so are all these different categories. And I think now looking back and even talking about it today, I feel like I learned so much more as a researcher by all of these variables happened at once. Whereas I could have done 10 different studies, and one of these things could have popped up in each of those 10 studies, but sort of all of them happened at once. And I don't know, I figured out a way, hopefully, where it's going to work out, but haven't finished it off yet. So
yeah, I just wish some of my lit friends were here, because I see we do very different things, but I see overlaps. You know, your collection of data is our reading of secondary sources, you know, and there's a lot of overlaps, and I really wish more of them had been here. But I'm wondering about that idea of primary and secondary material. What do you guys consider your primary material? Is it the data you collect, or how do you define those terms?
I think that's a question that's come up in some of our classes in the program. For most of us, I would say our primary material is the data. But it occurs in different forms. I'm thinking of Brian's dissertation. He's doing narrative research where he's writing his own stories, and those would be your primary sources. Or for some of us, we're relying heavily enough on some outside sources that they might also become primary sources. I don't know if you want to speak to that
I think
also.
that I would also classify some of my research and my literature review as primary, in that I looked at a couple of textbooks that were written out of studies that other creative writing researchers did, and so in those texts they included their research data that for me also has a sense of that sort of primary source background.
Yeah, I would agree too. I think the information that we research and end up building our lit reviews would be primary, because that is what we are then identifying the gap and then adding our new research and original data to it as well. So I think both.
But then there are also situations where you know, some critics are discussing other people's research, where I would view that as my secondary sources if I was looking at that from that perspective. Although I don't know that I've really even thought about this before you asked that question. It just sort of seems like, you know, whatever there happens to be and however it applies to what I'm looking for, you know, it becomes included. So.
Yeah. Cool, thanks.
any issues with the IRB? Like you said, you have done many changes and you have to report this or maybe to hide it to some extent. And you'll have to wait for 2 or 3 weeks, what to report to the IRB, what not to report. I think this is very, I really suffered from this issue. So did you have?
Yeah.
From
my experience working in a graduate school for 2 years and dealing with issues with IRB frequently, the advice always was if it did not substantially impact your original project, little tweaks were okay. However, coming up with new research questions, you would have to start over with IRB again.
And one thing that I would recommend, I spoke with Jay Mills, he's still the
Yes.
in charge of IRB,
Yes.
over the summer even. And I emailed him my protocol, I emailed him things, and he responded back and you know, let me know if there were any concerns, and then sort of expedited the process, because we had been in contact, and my dissertation, my protocol was eligible for expedited review. So I felt like when I was going through my coursework with the IRB, you sort of suffer in silence, and that's really not necessary. You know, I think reaching out and talking to them, they're really open to answering your questions and making sure that you get your protocol right the first time so that you don't have to keep going back and forth and making different changes. Now that said, I will be honest in the fact that not everybody completed my survey, so not everybody clicked that box with the informed consent. But for those people, they emailed me directly, and I responded to them and asked them what their confidentiality preferences were, and they responded to that. So I'll keep those emails as sort of documentation of their informed consent. But the survey, and they knew this was explained in my IRB protocol, I don't have any informed consent signed forms for the people that completed the survey, but the technology requires that you click that button before you can click continue. So if they get to the survey, it's implied that they had completed the informed consent. So I think that they are flexible, and it depends on who you talk to, but I think Jay Mills is one that he's really forward thinking with it, and he makes sure that you're in an appropriate situation and can conduct your research, which is really the most important thing.
I'll just add too that there's also a procedure in place to file a request for change in protocol. So once you've had your protocol approved, I didn't mention it here, but I had a latter stage of research where I had intended to do some interviews in person, and I changed and was going to do them through texting in a chat room. And so I simply filed a request for change in protocol, and you do have to wait a couple weeks, but once you have that initial protocol accepted, then it's usually okay to get
couple of
changes.
weeks for a thesis is a problem.
I know.
We have only limited time.